Let's try something a little different, shall we? From 1985 to 1992, the two-wheel drive front beam axles in the Cherokee and Comanche used very different wheel bearings. They're not like your traditional hub bearing setup as seen on the four-wheel drive models and the 93 plus two-wheel drives, but instead the brake rotor is your wheel bearing. In this video, I'm going to be replacing the brake rotor, the two wheel bearings that go with it, and the inner side seal. It's a good idea to also replace your brake pads, but I mean the ones on this truck are pretty much brand new. Here's everything we're going to need for the job. Some sort of hammer, 3/4 socket to get the wheels off. This is a 1 1/16 socket. Some pliers, flathead screwdriver, metal wire brush, some brake grease for the caliper slide pins. On that note, a 7mm Allen bit to get those out. You're going to need some wheel bearing grease. I'm going to make extra sure this stuff is rated to be used in wheel bearings specifically. Really, other than that, we're just going to need some brake cleaner, a new cotter pin, and a lot of paper towels, and some gloves probably. First we're going to get the caliper off. There's two 7mm Allen bolts that hold it on. With those slide pins out, I want to make sure we don't scrape these up at all, and these pretty much have no grease left on them. The caliper pivots off from the top on the driver's side and from the bottom on the passenger side. I'm just going to put that right there. For the pads, because I'm going to reuse them, I'm going to make sure to remember which one goes on the front and which one goes on the back. They're pretty good looking pads. And don't forget about this little spring thing down here. Now we're going to move on to the brake rotor. We first got to get this cap off. You're going to take a flathead screwdriver and wedge it behind the little lip. Lightly hammer on it. And it should pry off. Just like that. Okay, now that we've got our cotter pin available, there should be a cap on here that needs to come off, and then the nut should only be on there finger tight. Yeah, just like that. This is going to be a really messy job. Grab the whole brake rotor, slide it off a little bit, and then you should be able to grab the bearing, I mean its little protective cone, of course, right? And take that off of there. With that front sight off, the rotor can just come off, and it'll usually take the old bearing with it. You can see on the back side of the rotor, here's our seal, and there's the bearing inside there. So obviously you don't need to take this stuff out of the old rotor. I just kind of wanted to demonstrate how we're going to put it back together. Next, I'm going to clean all of the old grease off of this shaft. All of the old grease. You need to get this as clean as possible because the old grease is probably contaminated with stuff. I mean, honestly, in this case, the bearings look fine. This grease looks old, but still very usable. I've definitely seen them a lot worse than this. Also remember to clean off your old spacer and the nut and the little cap that goes on top of it. The new rotor, linked in the description, already has the bearing race pressed into it. So this bearing, that includes the new race, we just don't need to use this part. The new bearing, set 6 for the inside, is, you're going to notice it already has a lot of play in it, but that is as per factory specifications. There needs to be quite a bit of room in this thing because we are going to pack it full of grease. So I'm going to get a whole gob of grease, put it in my hand, and then we're going to take the bearing and like scoop the grease into the bearing. So we're going to start on the one side, and you're going to keep like scooping it into the bearing until you see it start to come out of the other side. And just repeat that like a bazillion times until you get it everywhere. Yes, everywhere. This is a very messy job. It's very, definitely wear some disposable gloves or something. go ahead and spin it. Work it in there even more. And that should be good. On the brake rotor, I'm going to take even more grease. You could just get it everywhere in here. Literally the only spot where you don't want grease is on the braking surface. So make sure you grease up that shim, and then we can just put the bearing in there. I'm going to take the seal and yes, get even more grease on the seal. It kind of acts as like a water barrier at this point. Just get grease everywhere. Seriously, everywhere. Do not be lenient with the grease. I'm just going to pop that in there, and then using some sort of a hammer, just kind of tap it down into place. Until it's flush. Before we put the rotor onto the shaft, you guessed it, I'm going to grease up the shaft. Doesn't need all that much on there, but just cover it. And then I'm going to take my gloves off so that when I touch this brake rotor, we don't get that grease all over the braking surface. I'm just going to take the rotor and slide it onto the shaft, and it pops right into place. I'm going to use the hammer to prop it up against the brake rotor so it doesn't fall off, because it totally will do that. Same story for the outer bearing. Set 2, the smaller one, goes on the outside. We don't need the race for it. Just going to grab a ton of grease and start scooping it into the bearing. Alright, once that's adequately greased, remember to just spin it a couple times, really work it in there. And then I'm just going to take it and put it on the shaft. Our cap we used from the old one, get a little bit of grease on that too, because may as well. And that's keyed, so it only kind of goes on there one way. And then the nut, which I'm going to again cover with more grease, and that will just thread onto there. So we can take this out of here. The nut only goes to a maximum of 12 foot-pounds, which is not very much at all. I'm going to tighten it with the socket in my hand, because I can get a bit more of a grip on the socket than I can with just my fingers on the nut. We're going to spin the rotor in a forward direction time or two. Get that back on there, tighten the nut. And it went a little bit tighter. This is basically just fully seating the bearings. Spin it around a couple times. Make sure that nut is all the way on there. And then we're actually going to take the nut back off. Just loosen it. And then tighten it up with just your fingers. Hand tight is all. That's as tight as it's going. Then we put the little cap thing on here, and that kind of has to go on a specific way to line up the hole for the cotter pin. Using a new cotter pin, you never want to reuse the old one. Slide that through the cotter pin slot, and with the cotter pin bent over on itself, we can then put on some more grease, because you thought we were done with the grease. It's gonna put a layer on the outside here. This is again mostly just a water seal. But then after you do that, we can put this old cap back on, kind of bop it in place, and we are done with the bearing parts. I should have done this while we had it all off, but you can go ahead and middle wire brush these sliding points for the brake pads. Really weren't that bad on here. And then I'm going to get all this grease off of the brake rotor here. And don't forget the back side too. The little spring for the brake pads is just going to sit on that bottom part here. And then we can put our back pad on top of that. And the front pad as well. And because I'm reusing the old pads. I shouldn't need to compress the piston on the caliper at all. Should just go right on there. Yep. I'm going to take some caliper grease, get it on these slide pins here, and then put those back in their slots. And finally, we can get the wheel back on, torque down the lug nuts to 80 foot-pounds, and go for a test drive.